toleration. Locke writes on tolerance. In the view of the Enlightenment, religious, specifically religious intolerance, had led to massive bloodshed and violence in the past. And so it was important then to respect the opinions and religious beliefs of others.
In 1685, the King of France, in alliance with the Catholic Church, revoked what was called the Edict of Nantes. And that edict had given the Protestant minority in France a limited degree of religious freedom. They could worship in private and so on and so forth. Well, 1685, Louis XIV says, this is over. You have choices. You either convert to Catholicism or you go to prison or you leave. And if there's any single event that acts as a catalyst for ushering in this age of enlightenment, it was the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, because all over Europe, Protestants and tolerant thinking Catholics were horrified. And France was a major, major power, and suddenly you had something like 250,000 refugees, Protestant refugees, fleeing out of France, going to the Dutch Republic, to England, to Switzerland, to parts of Germany. They came to America. There are towns founded on Long Island in upstate New York that were founded by French Protestant Huguenots. So religious toleration is absolutely fundamental. There was an interest in abolishing torture in criminal cases, in making prisons places where people could actually survive. I mean, going to prison in the 18th century was, in some places, a death sentence. There was a desire to separate church and state, to make the clergy accountable, to make monarchs accountable. And so this is an age where you begin to hear people saying things and eventually formulating theories of what we call democracy.
As might be expected, the men and women of the period did not think in lockstep, but espoused a wide range of opinions and beliefs. This was natural for a period in which independent thinking was the prevailing passion. Some retained a belief in God. Others considered atheism a more accurate view of reality. Even today, historians count the schools of thought in the Enlightenment differently.
Some people say there were two schools. I think there were actually three. There was what I would call a moderate or conservative Enlightenment that was willing, and generally you found this kind of Enlightenment more in Protestant than you did in Catholic countries, that was willing to incorporate religious ideas. And John Locke, the great English philosopher, is a very good example of that. I mean, Locke was a believing Christian, although he privately didn't believe in the Trinity, but he believed in God, and he believed that morality had to be structured around the principles of Christianity, and I would call him a kind of conservative, moderate to conservative philosophe. Then you get philosophes like Voltaire, who are deists. They believe in God, but that's it. And they are deeply anti-clerical. Voltaire was so naughty, he used to sign his letters, and he wrote, something like today, 20 volumes of letters. And he used to sign it with the phrase, "Écrasez l'infâme," crush the infamy. Now, letters were always being opened in those days by the government, so he didn't specify what the infamy was, but it was the Catholic Church. However, Voltaire, many of his friends, drew the line at atheism. They did not believe in atheism. But there's a radical kind of philosopher in the 18th century. So I'm making a kind of sort of a three-part distinction here that goes all the way out and embraces atheism, or what the age called materialism. And this was the belief that there was nothing in the universe but matter, and that nature is God, and that if you're going to worship anything, you would worship civil society. You would just say there is only the here and now. There is no heaven, there is no earth. All of these things are myths. And probably the most outrageous example of what I'll call the radical Enlightenment was a treatise that was written anonymously. We're still not absolutely sure who wrote it, although we got a pretty good idea now. And it was called The Treatise on the Three Impostors. And this thing was put together around 1710. And guess who the three impostors were? Jesus, Moses, and Mohammed. Now, that offended everybody. And that's the kind of extreme, radical form of enlightenment that I mean.
There are certainly atheists in the 18th century. The Baron d'Holbach was a famous one, Diderot, another, La Mettrie, another, and he's an interesting character in his own right. He was a doctor who, because of his radical views, fled France and lived with Frederick the Great, who was a great Prussian patron and king of people like Voltaire and La Mettrie and others. La Mettrie writes a book called L'Homme Machine, Man the Machine, arguing that all we know in the world is run by material processes, that there is no such thing as a soul, there's no distinction between mind and matter, it's all physical. More characteristic are people who want to scale religion back, who want to trim religion of its superstitious elements, get rid of the cult of miracles and the worship of relics, to look at the Bible critically and point out and acknowledge where it contradicts itself, to not let Scripture get in the way of investigating the origins of the earth or the evolution of human species. Nonetheless, that idea can coexist certainly with a belief in God. Voltaire maintained to the very end of his life that he was a theist, that he believed in a supreme being, a man or woman, who would, although in Voltaire's view was certainly a man, but a being who had set the world in motion, ordered it according to natural laws, and that in Voltaire's opinion there was evidence for this everywhere you looked, the best evidence being the argument from design, that if you look at an eyeball, or a nose, it's very apparent that it was designed for a specific purpose, to see or to smell. And in Voltaire's view, like many other educated people in the 18th century, that design could have only come about with the help of a supreme being and intelligence. So there are these ranges. There are also many enlightened Christians in the 18th century. And that's important, I think, to accept and realize, particularly in the United States. People, again, who want to take the spirit of the times and put it to the service of bettering humanity, using their reason constructively and whatnot, but trying to make that coexist with a belief and faith in Jesus Christ or another being.
Of course, the men and women of the Enlightenment didn't live in a historical vacuum. Just as we draw upon the insights of the great thinkers of the Enlightenment, the philosophes drew upon the wisdom of the sages who preceded them. In doing so, they sought to catalog all knowledge in a single reference. They called this reference the encyclopedia.
In the preface and the preliminary discourse, the encyclopedia, which is this great Enlightenment undertaking, an attempt on the part of Diderot and d'Alembert and others to synthesize everything that's been known to date, a massive undertaking and symbolic really of the whole Enlightenment project of using reason to put in one place and collect all that is thought and known. The preliminary discourse to the encyclopedia, d'Alembert writes it, says that there are important Enlightenment ancestors, people who have come prior to the Enlightenment, who didn't live in an enlightened age, but nonetheless were ushering in the light of the times. Isaac Newton is absolutely critical here. He's one of the great Enlightenment heroes. Voltaire writes a summary of Newton's Principia Mathematica. His mistress, Voltaire's mistress, Madame du Châtelet, translates the Principia, and it's used in France until the Second World War, so just a marvelous achievement. And it's worth pointing out here that there are not just hommes de lettres, men of letters in the 18th century, but femmes de lettres, women of letters. Madame du Châtelet is a perfect example. Well, Newton becomes an Enlightenment hero. Well, why? In some ways, he's appropriated. Newton, as you know, was a deep-thinking and devout man who spent as much of his life exploring the physical dimensions to the universe as studying scripture. He wanted to ascertain prophecy from the Old Testament, so he's a devout believer. Nonetheless, he seems, at least in the Enlightenment's eyes, to put forth the mathematical structure and laws to the universe, holding up a model of the way in which reason can ascertain the underlying structure of the world. And this becomes not only a huge achievement in its own right, but for Enlightenment thinkers, a model of the way that we might think about the world in other realms, in other non-physical realms, in moral realms. And many Enlightenment thinkers were enticed by the possibility that there was not only a natural physical law that underlay the universe, but a natural moral law, discernible like the laws of gravitation through reason. And that if we could figure out what they are, we could get people to agree on moral controversies in a way that they haven't always been able to when led solely by religion. Francis Bacon is another great Enlightenment hero, another man signaled by D'Alembert and others in the Preliminary Discourse. Bacon is important for the Enlightenment because he seems to get across in a very programmatic and self-conscious way the idea that science ought to serve humanity. Again, this stereotype, the received stereotype in Bacon's time, at the end of the 16th, the beginning of the 17th century, is of the scientist who's an alchemist, somebody who is not dealing with practical matters and certainly not bringing any benefit to humanity. Well, Bacon, even before science had become the force that it would become in the 18th century, nonetheless understood that science was going to shape profoundly human life, and that it ought to. It ought to do so in a positive way, that we should use reason and technology and science to the betterment of humanity. This is an idea that the Enlightenment thinkers take for granted, and they owe in part to Bacon.
Even as Renaissance men were heroes to the philosophers of the Enlightenment, the second generation of philosophers found heroes in the earlier generation of French philosophers.
John Locke is another important hero for the Enlightenment. If Newton was the man who discerned the physical structure of the universe, many people conceived of Locke as the Newton of the mind. In fact, that's the phrase that Voltaire used. Why? Well, the Locke of the Enlightenment, at least in Europe, is not the Locke of the United States, the Locke, that is, of the two treatises on government that were so important as background to the American Revolution. The Locke who's influential in France and elsewhere on the European continent in the 18th century is the Locke of the Essay Concerning Human Understanding, a work of epistemology, the science of how we know. And in that text, Locke puts forth his famous idea of the tabula rasa, that we're born into the world with a blank slate, a tabula rasa, without preconceived ideas. A notion that many of us take for granted today, but in the 17th century is relatively new. The dominant understanding then is that either we have preconceived or innate notions, a conscience, a kind of structure that underlies our mind, or there's the Christian notion of original sin. In other words, our nature is shaped in some way by the fall in the garden, the original sin of Adam and Eve that we all share. Well, Locke de-emphasized this aspect and argued that our minds are blank slates. And really are products of the sensations, the physical sensations, light and touch and sound and so forth, that we experience in this world. This seemed, for Enlightenment thinkers, a very powerful idea, because it opened the way then to conceiving of human beings as not inherently evil, as not inherently one way or another, but open to what was given to them in the world. So if the mind was a blank slate and you treated the mind well, if you gave it good things, you could grow human beings who were good as well. This is a powerful idea for Enlightenment